Last week, in terms of preparation for the mock, we looked at Gatsby and we linked in kind of wider reading, secondary criticism to that. So today we're going to look at kind of Hamlet again, just kind of getting your mindset back on those questions because we'll be looking at the coursework for a bit and just making you think about your kind of approach to this. So in terms of what we're going to look at, I just want to recontextualize. I want to just go through exactly why criticism is so important in relation to the Hamlet question, but try to make sure that you're not using it in the questions where it's inappropriate, but you're still seeing how it's useful to them. I've got a couple of pieces or extracts from, I'm not going to make you read the entire things, of kind of famous piece of criticism of Hamlet. And I'm going to want you to read through those to kind of annotate key points within them and identify kind of key arguments that come from them. Then I've just got a quick passage from Hamlet that will kind of approach using that criticism as a lens, kind of just to help us see into it, but not actually using it directly. I've put down a couple, but I've only popped in one kind of debate-based question to this, just to make you think about how the criticism could come into one of these kind of questions around Hamlet. So the first thing, just to place this into context, okay, you have now gone through Hamlet, you've looked at each scene in detail, you've started to look at different versions of the play. Now, you then want to kind of think, well, how do we take this further between now and the exam? And criticism is one of the best ways to do that, essentially, because now you've looked at the play as a whole. By reading the criticism, it's going to recall aspects of the play. It's going to get you to look at those aspects of the play in new ways. It's going to help you when you see an unseen extract, in that when you do that unseen extract question, you're not going to directly bring in the critics, but by having read the critics, it will help you understand any unseen extract from the play. The more critics you read, the firmer your understanding of different perspectives on Hamlet, the easier it will be for you to break apart those unseen extracts. You also need those critics because in the second Hamlet question, they are going to expect you to quote critical responses as part of your answer, and you just need to be able to kind of paraphrase and talk about overall points of view that critics have put across, but ideally you also want a few very brief bits from those critics that you can quote in as part of that response. As Hector would kind of put it, or Hector would horrifiedly kind of put across, you need little gobbets, what kind of Irwin reduces to gobbets of information. So from these longer pieces of criticism, you just need a few little bits that are quite adaptable and you can quote in different contexts and adapt to these different frameworks of argument, okay? So what I want you to do at this point, alongside this with the email, there's a document, and on that document are two pieces of criticism. One piece is by T.S. Eliot, the other piece is by Coleridge. You've come across, or you will come across, both of these authors. T.S. Eliot is the guy who wrote The Wasteland that we kind of compared in to the Valley of Ashes when we were looking at The Great Gatsby. Coleridge is going to be one of your central authors next year. We're going to look at a selection of his poetry. So I think in many ways looking at these two is also useful in terms of giving you some ideas around that kind of American lit section, and also helping you kind of understand the character and the figure of Coleridge for next year too. So have a read through both of their critical arguments. I want you to kind of highlight and make a note of what their point of view is about Hamlet as a play, and just highlight any short little kind of bits of them that are going to allow you to kind of quote and reflect that argument overall, okay? and then we'll kind of come back to it. So pause me here. You need to read through. It's kind of 6 pages or something. So it'll take you a little while to read through it properly, with the kind of annotation and stuff that goes with it. Okay, and then I'll just go through some kind of key points with it. So if I switch. Right, there might be a bit of a weird glitch in the recording there, just because the computer did a funny thing, and I'm now having to re-record this bit. Never mind. Okay, so you're essentially looking at T.S. Eliot. Hopefully, you've managed to kind of pick out various bits from his analysis. Remember, you don't have to agree with these critics, and indeed, in your second question, you're arguing different points of view and showing how there have been different interpretations before kind of coming to a conclusion of your own in relation to the kind of depiction. So, Eliot essentially criticizes other critics. He says that somebody like Coleridge has essentially projected himself into Hamlet. He says Coleridge, who made of Hamlet a Coleridge. He basically says he tried to see himself in the figure of Hamlet. And as we kind of go through, he basically takes issue with the fact that because Shakespeare is basing his play on an older play, he ends up with kind of flaws in what he's trying to depict, because he's trying to create something new whilst not discard everything of the old play, and this leads to kind of problems. And there's also flaws in Shakespeare's writing in and of itself, he sort of suggests. And he says the Hamlet of Shakespeare will appear to us very differently if, instead of treating the whole action of the play as due to Shakespeare's design, we perceive his Hamlet to be superimposed upon much cruder material, which persists even in the final form. So he's basically saying that because he's based it on older sources, there's kind of flaws within it. And yes, he's made changes, but they're not complete enough to kind of work, essentially. And he says, as you go kind of further down, from these three sources, clear that in the earlier play the motive was a revenge motive simply, and the action of delay is caused in the Spanish, as in the Spanish tragedy, solely by the difficulty of assassinating a monarch surrounded by guards, and that the madness of Hamlet is feigned in order to escape suspicion. So in the older version, it's simply to mitigate suspicion, and the problem and the questioning and the holding off is to do with simply the practicalities of it. But he says what Shakespeare depicts in this one is that the madness is not to lull the king's suspicion, but actually to arouse it, to lead him into rash action, to kind of antagonize Claudius, is the kind of aim of Hamlet's madness within Shakespeare's version. So he's working from the old material and twisting it and changing it, but not always successfully, is kind of Shakespeare's Eliot's implication. And he kind of continues, there's other useful bits that we can kind of draw from this. So that's why I scroll down. Yeah, he points out, and his point of view is that what Shakespeare is aiming for is that Hamlet's kind of problem, his madness, his issue lies with Gertrude's actions. So Shakespeare's Hamlet, so far as it is Shakespeare's, is a play dealing with the effect of a mother's guilt upon her son, and that Shakespeare was unable to impose the motive successfully upon the intractable material of the older play. So Shakespeare aimed to explore something different, to explore the way that Gertrude's kind of seeming betrayal has affected Hamlet, but he fails because he's limited by the older material and by his own kind of creative imagination and the way he's able to kind of bring it in. And he says basically, one of the reasons we find Hamlet so interesting is not that it's good as a piece of art, but that it's like the Mona Lisa. He compares it to the Mona Lisa in that we're intrigued by the kind of, if you imagine the Mona Lisa, the facial expression, what motivates that, the kind of, it's not the brush stroke and the technical quality of the art, it's the image itself. He says that Hamlet's the same. We're intrigued by certain bits of it, certain aspects of it, but it's not a good work of art. And he carries on with his argument that it's essentially Gertrude at the heart of it, and he points to another critic, Mr. Robinson, in concluding that this is correct. It's essentially the motion of the play is the feeling of a son towards a guilty mother. And he kind of goes, dun, dun, dun. Yeah, he says that what he finds, though, in terms of the flaw is there's not enough in Gertrude or in the kind of problems to actually warrant the way that Shakespeare depicts Hamlet. So Hamlet the man is dominated by an emotion which is inexpressible because it is in excess of the facts as they appear. So Hamlet's emotional response simply becomes melodramatic. It doesn't become understandable to Eliot's eyes. It becomes Shakespeare's at fault because he simply creates almost a melodrama here. And he talks about to have highlighted the criminality of Gertrude would have been to provide the formula for a totally different emotion in Hamlet. It's just because her character is so negative and insignificant that she arouses in Hamlet the feeling which she is incapable of representing. So he's basically saying there's a disparity between how Gertrude is represented to us and how Hamlet responds to us and reacts to her. The other important bits I think that we can pick out from the Eliot here. So we've got the Eliot sees it as a flawed play. He sees the fact that Hamlet's reactions don't match up with the reality of the situation. He sees Gertrude as the source of a lot of Hamlet's kind of actions at the root of them. And he also says about Hamlet's madness, so we get a perspective on his madness as well. Shakespeare, it is less than madness and more than feigned. So from his perspective, he sees Shakespeare as trying to kind of fit this grey area in which Hamlet is both mad but not mad. There's a kind of disparity in between this. And he's quite harsh as it kind of goes on. We must simply admit that here Shakespeare tackled a problem which is too much for him. It's quite kind of direct in his criticism. So we then get Coleridge. And Coleridge Coleridge likes the play a lot more. And Coleridge says, again, some interesting things about Hamlet, but he takes a kind of different perspective on what the source of his madness is. So you're already starting to see different critical points of view coming in. So for Eliot, it's rooted in kind of his feelings towards his mother, but the inaction is a kind of artistic failure. Whereas Coleridge takes a different tact. He sort of says that his inaction here, and let me find the kind of direct quote I want. Yeah, so he talks about kind of tragic flaws and how what Shakespeare aims to do within this one is, and this is at the bottom of the first page of the Coleridge one, wish to exemplify the moral necessity of a due balance between our attention to the objects of our senses and our meditation on the workings of our mind, an equilibrium between the real and imaginary worlds. In this balance, in Hamlet, this balance is disturbed. His thoughts and the images of his fancy are far more vivid than his actual perceptions, and his very perceptions, instantly passing through the medium of his contemplation, acquire as they pass a form and a colour not naturally their own. Hence we see an almost enormous intellectual activity and a proportionate aversion to real action consequent upon it, with all its symptoms and accompanying qualities. Now that's very wordy, but what you can kind of bring it down to is that for Coleridge, he sees Hamlet as inactive because he's too intellectual. He's too focused on the internal world, and this the balance, the equilibrium in his mind is skewed too far to the intellectual, so that the more instinctive actions simply cannot take place. So you can simply kind of paraphrase Coleridge's view from that. And he kind of develops this as we kind of go further through. Yeah, so you get, as you go further through, some kind of shorter quotations, which are much easier to kind of work into essays once you've kind of paraphrased in the kind of actual viewpoint. So, unseated from its healthy relation is constant, this is his mind, constantly occupied with the world within and abstract from the world without, giving substance to shadows and throwing a mist over all commonplace actualities. So, Hamlet's mind is creating of shadows substance and is throwing mist over all the realities of the world because it's too focused on that intellectual argument. And it's too focused on what he describes as the imaginative reflex. Hamlet feels this. His senses are in a state of trance, and he looks upon external things as hieroglyphics, as something difficult to understand, as something that he struggles to actually directly engage with. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so another couple of useful bits. He mistakes the seeing his chains for the breaking of them, delays action till action is no use, and dies the victim of mere circumstance and accident. I like that one because you can challenge it very directly. You can say that he doesn't die of circumstance and accident. By the end of the play, he's actually developed to a point where he can take action. So Coleridge's view is false there in a sense. But I think seeing his chains for breaking them is an interesting one. Hamlet very often talks about what is stopping him and sees these problems and faults, but that doesn't lead to him actually doing anything. The other interesting bit that kind of Coleridge talks about is he sees a lot of the kind of aside bits, the more kind of seemingly mundane bits, are simply a way to distract the mind from the kind of harsher truths out there. So we get that within, he uses the example of kind of the waiting for the ghost and the way that Hamlet is kind of drawn off into these wider philosophical debates in order to kind of distract himself from the kind of ghost's visitation that will follow and the trauma that goes with that. Yeah, so he says, but the truth is that after the mind has been stretched beyond its usual pitch and tone, it must either sink into exhaustion and inanity or seek relief by change. So it's a way of kind of escaping the reality of the situation. Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, and I think the last bit, of Coleridge's discussion is useful. These complex causes will naturally have produced in Hamlet the disposition to escape from his own feelings of the overwhelming and supernatural by a wild transition into the ludicrous, a sort of cunning bravado bordering on the flights of delirium. So his madness, his mockery of others, his kind of puns and innuendos at various points become a way of escaping the reality of the situation to Coleridge's mind. And perhaps, yeah, he plays that subtle trick of pretending to act only when he's very near to really being what he acts. So this is an interesting point in relation to the madness in that, like Eliot, he suggests that Hamlet's madness is very near to actual madness, that it's in that kind of middle ground. He's acting mad, but he can only do so because he is himself very near to mad. Pardon me. So you've got a similarity in their viewpoint here. Okay, let's move forward and kind of link into our questions at this stage. So, alongside this, I've also given you an extract Act 2, Scene 2, and you'd get the very standard kind of question that goes with it. Discuss the following passage from whatever act, whatever scene it is, exploring Shakespeare's use of language and its dramatic effects. Now, you will not, in this first Hamlet question, quote the critics directly. I'm going to, I've tried to hammer this home as much as physically possible, but occasionally you still see it creeping in. But their critical perspectives, by reading them, will help you understand the passage. So, as you look at this passage, consider a few things that we've kind of picked up on. Well, Eliot pointed out that one of the sources for his discontent is his kind of focus on the mother figure. Now, this appears indirectly in the passage, but think about how he depicts Fortune as a woman here, and how that kind of links in, and that might link back into his mother and his kind of the source of his kind of angst. So the image could be linked in. You don't have to say anything about Eliot, but it can link back in that sense. There is a sense of kind of excess in his moral state. You can argue that there is a kind of melodramatic depiction of his kind of his angst, his pain. And you can talk about the fact that his madness is less than true madness, and the fact is, to an extent, feigned. Those readings, seeing those critical views, are going to allow you to potentially develop it into the depiction we've got here, especially when you consider what has come before and what comes now. And that we do have within the extract a kind of more trivial and light-hearted discourse that potentially reflects a desire to break away from this contemplation of the darker purposes. And by having that, it's going to allow you to kind of situate the argument. That he's focused more on the internal world than the external, and you can look at that in relation to kind of the imagery that comes through as it kind of develops. And that he kind of runs from the kind of particular, from the kind of concrete facts, and he starts to kind of talk about universals rather than honing in on something specific. So what I want you to do, I just want you to approach that extract in a normal way, but hopefully the criticism will just help you being able to explain and decide on your lines of argument. So take that extract. I want you to do like you would do in the exam. I want you to give yourself about 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe, where you read it through, you pick out the bits that you would talk about in terms of the language and its kind of dramatic effects, but think about your actual lines of argument. What is shown here? What's being developed? What kind of dramatic effects are being used within this? And think about terminology that you could apply to it. But just think about how the way that the criticism has maybe helped you to kind of understand and go back over and kind of think about it. So, sorry, just to reiterate one more time. Next task, look at the extract, simply approach it as an extract question. Hopefully the criticism helps you understand maybe a bit more, and to simply talk in a more complex way and create more complex lines of argument around the play. Spend 10-15 minutes doing that, then I'll go through how I would respond to it and which bits I would pick out. Okay, so if I was approaching this one, the first thing I'd do is I'm trying to link the extract that I've got into what's come before, try to create some kind of cohesion between the two. And what we've got coming on here then, sorry, I've just got an email, let me show this one. Okay, sorry, distraction over. So I'd start out, you need to situate the extract, so I would be talking about that exit of Polonius and the shift in mood that we get. So in the earlier section of the scene, he's in his sort of seemingly mad, his kind of feigned mad state, and there's a far greater kind of sense of hostility towards kind of Polonius. A lot of his madness is to do with kind of drawing out Polonius's self-serving nature and that Hamlet has a realization about his true purposes there. So if I were introducing this extract, I would go something along the lines of the extract follows on from Hamlet's kind of goading of Polonius and the use of his antic disposition and feigned madness in order to kind of draw out and critique Polonius as a figure of the court. And I would point out that we get the shift in mood here, and at least initially, we get a more kind of light-hearted atmosphere and tone to this, with the entrance of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and their first reunion with Hamlet. We're aware as the play goes on that obviously this changes and he becomes more hostile to them. But here, at least initially, there's the sense of kind of friends reunited with some hints underneath. So once I've kind of talked about that shift, I've used that to kind of contextualize here. I would just briefly overview the fact that within the extract we see the reunion between Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and the seemingly kind of more relaxed nature of Hamlet and the revelations of his own kind of inner turmoils to them and their attempts to kind of calm him. So I'd then move on, and you need to start thinking about the actual kind of paragraphs you're going to create, the things that you're going to pick out. So I would point out simply that there's this seeming light-hearted nature to it, the friendship depicted. So you could talk about the use of the kind of epithets, my honoured lord, my most dear lord, and the exclamatory nature of the utterances, the use of that superlative, suggesting a kind of joy at the reunion, and the way in which there is a seeming kind of understatement to this. You get the kind of yeah, sorry, I changed my tact here. Hamlet initially appearing to kind of follow this as well. My most excellent good friends, where the adjectives suggest a kind of joy to see them. His language too is exclamatory. And he refers to them as good lads. How do you both? Where there's a more kind of colloquial aspect to his language here. And you can talk about the kind of bantering and innuendo that follows this, that this becomes something, again, it suggests a kind of closer friendship. It contrasts with what's happened before with Polonius. So in response to kind of asking how they are, you get the kind of extended kind of joking metaphor here. The kind of indifferent children of the earth, on fortune's cap, we're not the very button, so not the centre of fortune. But Hamlet sort of, you're not the soles of fortune's shoes either. So they're kind of bantering around where in fortune's light they lie. And it ends with the kind of innuendo, in the secret parts of fortune, oh, most true, she is a strumpet. What's the news? So there's something of the kind of comic within this, that kind of break in the play into a more kind of light-hearted element, the joy that goes with it. You've got the epithets, you've got the superlative, you've got the exclamatory nature, you've got the more colloquial aspects, you've got the innuendo and the bantering around the image of fortune. You can then develop into there's the degree to which this is undermined and the more subtle undermining of their motives and a wider cynicism. Yeah, sorry. I started to reread. I thought I phrased it badly then for a second. Yeah, where, you know, that discussion of strumpet, fortune, and the metaphorical description of her as a strumpet suggests something. Yes, it's kind of bantering around fortune itself, the idea that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern live in her nether regions. But the depiction of Fortune as a female, as of a strumpet, reflects back into Hamlet's kind of greater preoccupation with women and with the failures of women that's been revealed to us before. Strumpet is a term for whore, so Fortune is a whore, open to the highest bidders. And he questions them around their kind of motivations. None, my lord, but the world's grown honest. Then is doomsday near. So Hamlet's discourse is shaped to kind of undermine Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, the kind of personification of the world, and that it's kind of grown honest is taken aside. Okay, and Hamlet is depicted as starting to challenge the kind of motivations of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. You get that kind of shift, but your news is not true, where you get the conjunction and the challenge within it, and the kind of negation. Your news is not true. He kind of challenges their truthful nature, and we know through dramatic irony, which is something you could mention here, that their true motivations to be here are indeed stimulated by the king. And it shows a kind of level of perception on Hamlet's part within this section, that he's sort of seemingly aware of this. Let me question more in particular what you have, my good friends, deserved at the hands of Fortune, that she sends you to prison hither. Where what you can kind of talk about here is that the kind of the initial epithet good friends, which appears more genuine, now takes on a more kind of sarcastic tone towards both of them. And the kind of the doomsday, the reference the day of judgment as part of it. I'd then kind of turn to talk in how kind of Hamlet's mood is kind of depicted as shifting within this, growing increasingly kind of bleaker. So the extended metaphor of the prison image here, the idea, what sends you to send you to prison hither, that kind of interrogative with its metaphor of the prison coming into it. It's continued with Denmark's a prison, and Hamlet, yeah, it's a goodly one in which there are many confines, wards, and dungeons, Denmark being one of the worst, where the superlative highlights his kind of distress and simply that extended depiction, showing that Hamlet feels that he himself is entrapped, that this kind of Denmark in a non-specific way has become painful to him and a constricted setting to him, without him revealing the true motivations that underlie this to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. And as we kind of look at it further through, yeah, you might talk about the kind of euphemistic, I have bad dreams, where it kind of hints at something underlying this, but it's made non-specific. The source of his kind of pain, the audience is aware of in terms of his inner motivations, but he doesn't reveal that directly to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern as part of it. I'd then probably kind of use the discussion of ambition in order to kind of create the link to what follows. This discussion leads into this kind of transition into the court, so it serves a kind of social criticism. He's talking about ambition, and again, you talk about the use of metaphor at the close of the passage, and truly I hold that ambition of so airy and light a quality that it is but a shadow, shadow, and you can talk about how this is made to seem ironic through the wider dramatic irony. We know that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are depicted as kind of ambitious, and Hamlet's more kind of cynical tone coming into this, then are we beggars' bodies, and our monarchs outstretched heroes, and outstretched heroes the beggars' shadows. So he's basically saying, well, if I believe that, then basically, then kings and monarchs and heroes are simply they have no ambition. They're just the shadows of beggars. So there's a kind of cynicism that comes into this, and it leads into the question, the interrogative: shall we to the courts? For by my fay I cannot reason, will wait upon you, my lord. It creates a kind of social criticism within that movement about the ambition that drives the court, that Hamlet is aware of this, and there's that kind of more subtle criticism that's going to develop into a more overt and hostile relation with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern later on, that's eventually going to end up with him having them murdered. So you've looked at the extract, you think about the lines of argument, you've mentioned things sort of potentially that have been stimulated by that critical discussion, the link into kind of Fortune as a strumpet, linking back to his wider motivations, the kind of source of his madness and indecision. You talk about the kind of the light-hearted bantering element as this kind of shift between that's kind of picked up on in the criticism. So all these things are leading into your understanding without being talked about directly. But just to finish us off, you might, for the second question, get something that's going to allow you to talk about that criticism more directly. So you could get something like this: often the actions, or indeed the inactions, of Hamlet lack a clear motivating factor. In this context, I should just clarify here, what I mean is not just the character of Hamlet, but it would allow you to talk about the wider play of Hamlet. So I should have italicized that, but never mind. And then you get the same bit that always follows: using your knowledge of the play as a whole, show how far you agree with this view. Remember to support your answer with reference to different interpretations. Now, I'll just point out a couple of kind of things here, then I'll leave it to you. If you want to go out, plan this in more detail, you could do. Now, if you were discussing this, and you're talking about the actions or inactions, and you're trying to link in your criticism, you could say something along the lines of, well, different critics have pointed to different motivating factors surrounding Hamlet's actions and inactions. Whilst Coleridge points to his actions or his inactions as being linked to his overly intellectual personality. And you would link in a bit of criticism, you could have a little quotation from it. You could then, point to aspects of the play and give direct evidence that would prove this. You might then develop into, however, other critics such as T.S. Eliot have seen Hamlet's inactions as being more linked to a failure in Shakespeare's artistic technique, and you would then point to features that do this, where Hamlet seems overly melodramatic, where he seems to have taken things out of proportion entirely. You might point to those early scenes where he kind of contemplates suicide, but there's actually a logic to what Claudius and Gertrude kind of say to him in terms of, well, this is a bit over the top, everyone's father dies. So you could link into those kind of bits there as your support for the point, but you've worked in the two critical points of view. And there's lots more you could do with this. You could talk about Ophelia, you could talk about Claudius, you could talk about Gertrude within this idea of actions or inactions, whether they have a motivating factor. You could say yes, they do on one level, or no, they don't, and you can debate around the point. Okay, so I would say go away, have a think about this as a question, see how you could plan it out. You could even have a go at writing it if you want, but that's where we'll leave it for the moment.